A black woman boards a first-class flight with a paid ticket, quiet confidence, and no expectation of trouble. But within minutes, she's confronted, questioned, and humiliated by the flight crew just because she didn't look the part. What they didn't know: she wasn't just a passenger. She owned the airline. And exactly 18 minutes later, she began firing people mid-flight. What followed was a storm no one saw coming. Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? And if this story shakes you like it did us, hit that like button and subscribe for more. It all started with a simple boarding pass. They told her to step aside, not with concern, not with procedure, but with that old American arrogance that no longer needs to raise its voice. This cabin's not for you, they said, not with words, but with glances that dismissed her existence and posture that announced ownership over air and sky. Naomi Sinclair had heard it before. Not always in words, but in doorways left unopened, in hands not extended, in silence that stung sharper than any slur. Her boarding pass had already been scanned. Her seat, 1A, was hers. Not by accident, not by lottery, but by the weight of a career no one in that cabin could fathom. But still, the flight attendant, a thin woman named Madison with a trained smile and eyes that trembled only when met directly, stepped in front of her. "May I see your boarding pass again, ma'am?" It wasn't a question. It was a test. Naomi's hand moved with composure. She presented the pass again, watched as Madison's face turned from uncertainty to something far worse, certainty confirmed by discomfort. "Thank you," Madison muttered, but she said it like she was swallowing sand. Naomi smiled, a tight, practiced smile she had worn in courtrooms, at fundraising galas, and on conference panels where they introduced her last despite her being the one who signed their checks. She walked past a man in a red tie, too loose around his neck, who leaned back with a chuckle. "Economy's that way, miss," he said, not bothering to look her in the eye. Madison didn't stop him. The cabin was velvet-draped and wine-scented, lined with those who believed their presence was divine. Naomi placed her bag in the overhead bin, sat down, and exhaled. She wasn't here for luxury. She wasn't here to impress. She was here because she earned this. But in America, a black woman earning anything is always suspect. They brought champagne to her row. They skipped her. The man in 1B accepted his flute with a nod and side-eyed Naomi like she was the question on an exam he hadn't studied for. Madison walked past again, this time with warm towels. Naomi received neither. Not even the decency of eye contact. The message was clear: you may have bought the seat, but not the space. And yet, Naomi remained still. Outside her window, the ground crew worked like ants, insignificant to the grand stage above them. Inside, the tension pressed against her like humidity, dense, invisible, and entirely unavoidable. It wasn't until the in-flight screen blinked awake beside her and her name was nowhere to be found, replaced by a Catherine DeWitt, that Naomi knew this wasn't an accident. She called Madison back. "My name isn't listed. Your system moved me to coach." Madison's lips tightened. "Minor display error," she said. "But that error," Naomi replied calmly, "only applies to me." There it was again. Not a gun, not a baton, not a law written in blood, but a screen, a glitch, and the lie that it was no big deal. And still, no apology. No attempt to restore her humanity. A supervisor came next. His name was Trent. He wore glasses that made him look kinder than he was. He offered her 18C, "just until we sort this out." He said it like a kindness. Naomi leaned forward, her voice precise. "You're asking me to move, not because you doubt my payment, but because your system refuses to acknowledge I belong. Do you see the difference?" Trent blinked. "Ma'am, it's just for optics." She leaned back. "Then you better improve your optics." When the Port Authority officer boarded, badge gleaming, voice devoid of emotion, Naomi didn't flinch. She handed over her passport. She showed the app with her paid reservation. She did all of it with the same grace Black women have been forced to master, not to soothe, not to surrender, but because if she didn't, the lie of danger would replace her name in the final report. He took her ID and walked off without a word. No apology. No dignity. And yet Naomi stayed. Because the seat was hers. Because the truth was hers. Because silence is often the only language power understands. But when he came back, passport in hand, and said everything checks out, he might as well have said nothing at all. It didn't erase what had already been taken, the comfort, the ceremony, the right to just be. Then came the final blow. "Ma'am," Madison said, returning with a new stranger by her side, "we're going to need you to collect your belongings and step off the aircraft while we finalize a few confirmations." It wasn't a request. It was an extraction. Naomi looked around the cabin. No one spoke. A few watched with curiosity, some with glee. Others looked away. She stood slowly, deliberately. The dignity of her steps screamed louder than any of their accusations. At the jet bridge, a man with slicked hair and a phone asked how it felt to be kicked off a plane she couldn't afford. Naomi didn't answer. She didn't need to. Because what none of them knew, what they all refused to see, was that this plane, this airline, and their entire perception of control was about to come undone. And it started right here with a woman who refused to shrink. Naomi stood in the sterile waiting area just beyond the jet bridge, the glass wall beside her offering a perfect view of the aircraft she'd just been removed from. It looked like any other plane, polished, purposeful, unmoved. But that plane, in this moment, had become something else entirely. Not transportation. Not luxury. It had become a stage for a familiar American performance. One where the scripts never say the word race, but every line echoes it. A young man in a black suit stood beside her, holding a tablet with her name on the screen, but unable to meet her eyes. "Miss Sinclair," he said, his voice syrup-thick with a rehearsed apology. "We're reviewing a minor technical issue involving your boarding record." Naomi didn't answer. She wasn't interested in the theater of customer service. Her mind was already pulling apart the machinery behind the scene, how it started, who had made the call, and how many of them had known exactly what they were doing while pretending they didn't. Inside the plane, things had not returned to normal. Normal had been broken the moment Naomi's body had entered that cabin, too black, too poised, too undeniable. And now, passengers whispered, not about what they saw, but about what it meant. On the tarmac, Naomi watched as two maintenance workers ambled toward the nose of the plane. The aircraft's engines remained still, its doors still connected. Something had shifted. The wheels of authority had started to grind, but not on her side. Not yet. It was the man in 3A who noticed it first. Silver-haired, navy suit, and old enough to know the cost of mistaking quiet for weakness. He leaned toward his neighbor and murmured, "That's Naomi Sinclair. She's not just a businesswoman. She's a businesswoman." Inside, recognition began to spread like ink on wet paper. Outside, Naomi sat quietly, legs crossed, hands folded in her lap, waiting, but not idly. She was remembering. Not just the incident, but all the times before. The interview in '95 where the CEO complimented her articulate tone. The hotel clerk in Zurich who double-checked her reservation when her white assistant made it. The senator who once whispered she was impressive for someone from Detroit. It was all part of the same mechanism. The same machine. This country didn't need burning crosses or snarling dogs anymore. No, it had evolved. Now it had technicalities. It had policies. It had people in navy suits saying "ma'am" with weapons disguised as civility. Back on the plane, the murmurs grew teeth. "You mean that Naomi Sinclair? She was on the cover of Forbes last year. She didn't get kicked off, did she? They made her get off the plane?" Jesus. At the front, the pilot emerged, eyebrows furrowed, phone in hand. "We're holding departure," he said flatly. Compliance flagged a passenger handling issue. Compliance. That word had weight. Naomi had built her career on compliance, on knowing exactly how systems fail and how people pretend they don't. Now she was watching one fail in real time, its face as blank and brittle as a flight attendant named Madison. Then it came, a quiet buzz on her phone. A message from Elena, her chief of staff. Skylux Legal's been informed. Pull scoreboard on standby. Decision is yours. Naomi smiled without smiling. She stood. And as she turned toward the boarding gate once again, it was not defiance that filled her chest. It was precision. Grace sharpened by injustice. The kind only black women of a certain age and a certain weariness know how to wield. When she stepped back aboard, everything changed. No announcement. No apology. Just presence. And presence, my friend, is a kind of weapon too. The plane had not moved. Engines dormant, jet bridge still clutched to the cabin door like a hesitant goodbye. Naomi walked slowly down the aisle, past champagne flutes half full, past the smirks that had hardened into something else. Her heels didn't clack loudly against the carpeted floor, but their rhythm seemed to count the seconds until discomfort became conscious. Until silence felt complicit. She returned to seat 2A without ceremony. Not a single hand reached out to help her. Not a word of welcome or apology from the crew. And in that stillness lay the most American of contradictions, civility without humanity. The plane was full of polite faces, raised in polite homes, taught polite histories. Yet none of that politeness had prevented what had happened. They had watched her be removed not because of what she had done, but because of what she represented. And they had watched without protest. Madison, the flight attendant, emerged from the galley, her steps clipped with forced professionalism. In her hands, a tray of warm towels. She offered them to rows 1 and 3, skipping row 2 entirely as though it no longer existed. Naomi looked forward, untouched. That was how it was done now. Not with slurs. Not with fire hoses. But with omission. With the choreography of denial. Across the aisle, a woman with pearl earrings and a textbook on leadership in crisis glanced at Naomi, then away. She had been nodding minutes ago when Naomi was escorted off, murmuring agreement to her husband about protocols. Now her jaw was set tight, her gaze flickering between curiosity and fear. Naomi knew that look too. It was the look of someone who had spent her life believing that she was good because she was not openly cruel. But cruelty has many tones, and silence is one of them. The man in seat 3C, who had once laughed at the idea of Naomi occupying first class, now buried his face in a finance magazine. But the way his fingers trembled at the corners of the pages gave him away. He had seen the shift too. Not in Naomi, no, she had not changed. But in the perception of her, power had arrived with no announcement. No crescendo. Just a quiet return to a seat that was always hers. A young attendant, Grace, passed by, her eyes flickering with guilt. She offered Naomi a bottle of water. No words, just a gesture. And yet, even that small kindness felt like a rupture. Madison stiffened in the galley, watching. That's how the system defends itself. Not with the truth, but with loyalty to the lie. And the lie was that Naomi didn't belong. The captain emerged once more, murmuring into his earpiece, eyes scanning the cabin like a man trying to gauge the depth of water before diving in. He paused at Naomi's row, his voice neutral. "Miss Sinclair, we appreciate your patience. We're resuming boarding procedures." Naomi didn't look at him. She didn't nod. She didn't need to. The truth was already doing the speaking. In the gate area, a murmured conversation had begun. A flight delay. A passenger issue. Something about the manifest. A middle-aged man with a Bluetooth headset muttered to his assistant, "They pulled the wrong one this time." By the time Naomi reopened her phone, messages had begun to pour in. Journalists. Legal. Activists. And one quiet note from her sister, "Just breathe. You taught them how to fly. Don't let them convince you to crawl." She closed her eyes. Breathed in. The cabin hummed. The engines stirred. But the tension remained, thick as scripture, old as sin. Because racism never leaves the room. It only changes its clothes. The aircraft finally taxied from the gate, but inside, the cabin remained anchored to something heavier than wheels on tarmac. The air moved, but did not feel free. Naomi sat in 2A, eyes forward, posture like scripture, upright, unflinching. She didn't shift when the seatbelt sign dinged or when the man beside her coughed into his sleeve and pretended it wasn't nervousness. Her presence had become something the crew now orbited around without making contact, like a sun no one wanted to acknowledge was burning. As the plane climbed, so too did the ritual of subtle exclusion. The welcome video begins to play, but Naomi's screen stays dark. Her tray table stuck slightly, not broken, just stuck, like so much in this country, functional for some, flawed for others. When the food cart reached her row, the young attendant Grace once again hesitated. Naomi watched her. The girl's hands trembled, her voice a half-octave higher than it had been with other passengers. "Chicken or pasta, Ms.?" Her voice faltered. Naomi let the pause stretch. "Miss Sinclair," she said flatly. "Pasta." Grace nodded, fumbling. Madison loomed behind her, watching with a disapproving tilt of her chin. But it was too late. The acknowledgement had happened. And acknowledgement, for people like Naomi, was revolution in miniature. Across the aisle, the man with the Wall Street tie tapped away at his tablet. His eyes kept flicking toward Naomi, then back to the report he was editing. He didn't know she had built the encryption framework his firm had just purchased. He didn't know her signature sat in the metadata of the very code he was now claiming in a strategy proposal. All he knew was that the woman next to him was not supposed to be his equal, let alone his architect. The real turbulence, Naomi knew, wasn't outside the window. It was in the discomfort now simmering across row 2. A discomfort not born of guilt, but of recognition. They were realizing that their power had always rested on an unspoken agreement, that she wouldn't be there. And now she was. Mid-flight, the supervisor from earlier, the one who had asked her to move without ever checking the system, returned. His voice was a whisper she could barely hear over the hum of the engines. "We'd like to offer you a complimentary voucher for your inconvenience." Naomi tilted her head. "Is it an apology?" He blinked. It's just a gesture." "A gesture of what?" His mouth moved, but no answer came. He held out the voucher like it might erase what had already been written into memory. Naomi didn't take it. Instead, she looked past him, out the window, where the clouds didn't discriminate and the sky didn't ask for permission. "I'll pass," she said quietly. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. At that moment, her refusal became louder than anything else on that plane. Back in the galley, Madison hissed something at Grace, too low for others to hear, but Naomi saw the girl's shoulders stiffen. The tension was evolving now, like a disease moving into its next stage. Where once there had been passive denial, there was now active resentment. Because whiteness, when confronted by dignity it cannot erase, often seeks punishment instead of reckoning. By the time the plane began its descent, the whispers had returned. A passenger from business class had walked forward mid-flight, pretending to stretch, just to glimpse the black woman at first. Another had pulled out their phone, tried to discreetly Google her name. The turbulence had less to do with altitude than with the fact that a woman like Naomi Sinclair refused to perform gratitude for the privilege of breathing the same air. As they touched down, the captain made no eye contact during the landing announcement. Grace offered Naomi a soft smile as she collected trash. Madison passed by without a glance. But the real reckoning was waiting at the gate. As the plane taxied, a man in a crisp charcoal suit stood just beyond the glass of the jet bridge, flanked by 2 others, one holding a portfolio, the other a tablet. Naomi recognized him. He was an executive liaison for Skylux Holdings. His face was tight with urgency, not apology. He wasn't here for the passengers. He was here for damage control. Naomi didn't rise when the bell rang. She waited. She always had. The others filed out, trying not to look, each of them carrying the memory of her silence like a stone in the shoe. When the aisle cleared, she rose, smoothed her jacket, and stepped into the narrow corridor between two worlds, the one they thought she came from and the one she built. Outside, the man extended a hand. "Miss Sinclair, if we could have a word." She walked past him. She didn't stop. Because a seat isn't enough. Not if the table was never meant to feed you. The airport lounge was all brushed steel and synthetic calm, a curated silence filled with the polite hum of business travel. Naomi sat by the window, her posture immaculate, her eyes scanning the tarmac, but seeing something deeper, older. A memory, perhaps, or a familiar ache. Her phone vibrated against the glass table, lighting up with a message from a number saved only as ED office. It was short. "You were seen." The words echoed, not with comfort, but responsibility. Because being seen didn't mean being safe. It meant being accountable for what others now expected of her. She rose when summoned. A staff member in a Skylux blazer approached with a corporate smile, taut and trembling. "Miss Sinclair, the board liaison would like a moment of your time." "Just here, in the executive wing." Naomi followed without a word. The hallway they entered was quiet, walls lined with award plaques and portraits, none of them resembling her. Inside the conference suite stood a man with silver temples and the posture of someone who had never been told no. His nameplate said Monroe, VP of Compliance. He did not shake her hand. "Miss Sinclair, I'll be blunt. We're in the middle of a social media storm. Your name's attached to every major headline right now. We're facing reputational risk." He paused, as though that alone justified everything. Naomi cut in. "You mean your risk? Your discomfort? Let's not confuse that with consequence." He flinched, but continued. "It's imperative we discuss optics. Perhaps a formal clarification from your office? Something to reaffirm faith in Skylux's integrity." Naomi let silence fill the room. Then, integrity isn't a press release. It's what you do when there are no cameras. And your crew failed that test. His nostrils flared slightly. "Look, Miss Sinclair, we've reviewed the manifest. There was no intent to discriminate. Just a system error." Naomi stood. "A system error is when the printer jams. What happened to me was procedural cruelty." She turned to leave. "You're not afraid of the mistake. You're afraid people finally saw it." Back in the lounge, Naomi found herself alone again. Her phone buzzed, another message, this time from a junior analyst at her firm. Just 3 words, "Board is watching." She knew what that meant. Not concerned for her, but calculation. How this would affect shareholders, future partnerships, international optics. Power was never personal. It was always conditional. That evening, she stepped into a black car sent by her office. As it pulled into traffic, the driver, a black man in his late 60s, adjusted the rearview mirror. Their eyes met. "They gave you hell, didn't they?" he asked. Naomi gave a half smile. "They gave me what they always do. The performance of equality, without the burden of justice." He nodded. "My wife used to say, we ain't asking to be worshipped, just to be left alone in peace." Still fighting for that, huh? Naomi didn't answer. The quiet said enough. Later that week, she was invited to a closed-door forum on corporate ethics. The room was full of executives, mostly white, mostly male, mostly unsure how to sit near her without performing contrition. One man, heavy-set, in a cobalt tie, leaned forward during the panel. "Don't you think we're all victims of the moment now? Social media, cancel culture. Things escalate before facts come out." Naomi looked him in the eye. "It's not the moment that creates injustice. It's just the first time it's being recorded by someone other than you." Laughter rippled through the room. Nervous. Hollow. But one man, an elder, black, in a tailored wool coat, nodded slowly. His eyes met hers and stayed, and Naomi felt, for the first time that week, that she wasn't alone. Because racism, like rot, thrives best in silence. And her existence was beginning to make noise. As she exited the forum, a young woman approached, brown-skinned, 20-something, a notebook clutched to her chest. "Ms. Sinclair, I just wanted to say, thank you for staying in your seat." Naomi paused, then reached out and touched the girl's arm gently. "Next time," she said, "don't thank me. Sit beside me." The rhythm was building now, not fast, but certain. The ground shifting beneath a polished world. And somewhere deep in the bones of America, an old silence cracked just a little more. Naomi walked through the revolving doors of the Midtown glass tower like a storm wearing pearls. She had spent the weekend in silence, not a retreat, but a strategy. The kind of quiet black women carry like armor, mistaken for submission but forged from centuries of memory. Monday morning arrived not with apology, but with anticipation. She stepped into the boardroom of Pulscore Ventures, where 14 eyes waited for her arrival, some narrowed, some widened, none neutral. A junior executive cleared his throat. "Ms. Sinclair, the acquisition review team is here. They'd like clarity on your decision to suspend the Eastgate contract." The room shifted, ever so slightly, as if no one dared breathe until she did. Naomi placed her leather folder on the table and sat. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The contract was contingent on ethics compliance. Their internal advisor was complicit in my removal. The clause is clear. Breach nullifies obligation. "But that's $400 million, someone blurted, before catching himself. Naomi turned slowly. "And what's the cost of pretending dignity is negotiable?" No one answered. They shifted in their tailored suits, stirring the scent of cologne and discomfort. Outside, the sky was the color of steel and smoke. Naomi watched the clouds move with indifference. She thought about how white clouds are never asked to explain themselves, how privilege is allowed to drift, unexamined. Later that afternoon, her assistant Elena brought in a manila folder. HR pulled background on Claire Hastings, the lead attendant. Naomi didn't look up. "And?" Elena hesitated. "She's engaged to one of Eastgate's directors. The contract referral was hers. She never disclosed the relationship." Naomi leaned back, her mind assembling the quiet connections, how comfort turns into protection, how bias wears the mask of process. She nodded once. "Forward it to compliance. Let it be recorded." That night, Naomi stood alone in her kitchen, barefoot, a glass of water sweating in her hand. The television murmured in the background. A panel of commentators debated whether her response was proportional, whether removing a crew, halting a flight, triggering audits and legal scrutiny was too much. She didn't listen. She knew that when a black woman finally answers back, the world often mistakes justice for vengeance. She poured the water into the sink, letting it drain like the weight she wasn't allowed to show. Her phone vibrated. A message from a stranger. It read, "My daughter was on that flight. She saw what they did. And she saw you stand. Thank you for not letting her believe silence was safer." Naomi stared at the screen. Then she sat down, not from exhaustion, but from the gravity of being watched. Because every black woman who dares to sit in a first-class seat, who dares to own the company, to rewrite the narrative, becomes more than herself. She becomes a mirror. And people will do anything not to look. The next morning, headlines had shifted. Not to apologize, but to analyze. Olivia Brooks, they now called her, the calm storm. NPR led with the CEO who stayed seated. The Wall Street Journal posed the question, when procedure meets prejudice, who pays? At Skylark's headquarters, internal memos flew like shrapnel. New training. Emergency meetings. PR bandages laid over open wounds. But for Naomi, the reckoning wasn't revenge. It was the recalibration of a world that had tilted too long in one direction. She gave an interview that week. Quiet, measured. She wore no bold lipstick, no designer brooch. Just her truth. "I didn't raise my voice because I wasn't taught that would save me. I raised my presence. And sometimes, That's the loudest sound in the room. The interviewer, a white woman in her 60s, leaned in. Do you think anything will change? Naomi paused. Not everything, but something. And something becomes a seed. That evening, a photo began circulating online. Naomi Sinclair, seated quietly in 2A, window light casting her in silhouette, the ghost of resilience on her face. The caption read, "She didn't ask to be exceptional. She was forced to be." The tempo was rising. The contradictions between how the world sees Black excellence and how it tries to bury it grew sharper. The price of being calm wasn't silence. It was the burden of knowing your dignity might still be denied, even as the world nods at your name. But Naomi was no longer waiting to be allowed. She was building the door. The week began with a statement, not from Naomi, but from Skylux. A carefully worded press release landed in inboxes at 8:03 a.m., filled with corporate absolution. Phrases like regrettable incident, commitment to equity, and internal investigation pending dressed the page like civility at a funeral. But the dead remained unnamed. The wound unstitched. Naomi read it in her office alone. The blinds were half drawn. Sunlight broke across the hardwood floor like judgment. She didn't flinch. She had read 1,000 statements before, crafted them, even, each one a gentle burial for truth. Her phone rang. A familiar voice on the other end. Malcolm, her brother. A retired teacher, a man with hands that still bore chalk scars. "I saw the release," he said. "Slick. Real pretty. But it ain't accountability. It's camouflage." Naomi exhaled. "I know." He paused. "You gonna let them wrap this in a ribbon and call it reconciliation?" "No," she said. "But I also won't let them bait me into rage just to dismiss it." That evening, Naomi accepted an invitation to speak, not on television or a conference stage, but at a town hall in Philadelphia. A community center on the edge of a zip code people only visited with charity or consequence. The crowd was mostly older, mostly Black, mostly tired of surviving systems designed to erase them with courtesy. She stood at a simple podium. No lights. No teleprompters. Just folding chairs, a humming radiator, and history in the walls. "They told me I didn't belong," she said. "And I didn't shout. I stayed." But staying, being still while disrespected, isn't surrender. It's a strategy. Because when they can't shake you, they start shaking. A woman near the front nodded. Silver hair, Bible on her lap, eyes sharp enough to cut stone. "You didn't move because we couldn't," she said. "You carried us." Naomi bowed her head. "I carried what they refused to see." The next day, Skylux's board held an emergency session. Not because of lawsuits, though those were coming, but because of investors. The kind who smiled at Black keynote speakers while quietly redirecting funds elsewhere. One of the directors, a man named Sterling, leaned across the table. "This is not a diversity issue. This is a containment issue. We're hemorrhaging goodwill." Naomi wasn't in the room, but her presence filled every silence. That afternoon, Claire Hastings was spotted outside a federal building, walking beside a labor attorney. She didn't smile. She didn't wave. For the first time, she looked like someone who understood the difference between consequence and victimhood. Meanwhile, Naomi was requested to meet with a federal oversight panel, not as a defendant, but as a witness. The FAA, prompted by internal whistleblowers, had opened a review into Skylux's practices. The hearing was private. The tone, polite. But every question reeked of a familiar rot. "Do you believe your race played a role in how you were treated?" Naomi smiled politely. "I believe systems don't act. People do. And people are taught every day who deserves comfort and who deserves compliance." The room went still. The panelists scribbled notes. One older white man cleared his throat. "You're remarkably composed." "I have to be," she said. "You don't hear Black women when we shout. Only when we whisper through clenched teeth." That night, on the news, a clip aired. A former Skylux contractor, white, Male, anonymous, speaking through voice distortion. They knew who she was. Claire even joked about it. Said, let's see how powerful she really is. It wasn't ignorance. It was a test. Naomi didn't watch the clip. She didn't have to. She already knew the questions would keep coming, each one dressed like curiosity, each one shaped like a scalpel. Later, she returned to her childhood neighborhood. A visit without security, without press. She walked the same cracked sidewalks, nodded to the same corner grocer who used to sneak her bubble gum when her mother wasn't looking. A young boy stared at her from a stoop. You the plain lady? He asked. Naomi smiled gently. Depends who's asking. He grinned. Mama said you didn't let them move you. She said that was brave. Naomi knelt beside him. It wasn't bravery. It was a memory of every time they tried to move us before. He blinked. Did it work? She looked out at the street. The broken light. The hanging wire. The neighborhood that refused to disappear. It's working, she said. Slow, but working. The contradictions of America had not ended. The lines between protocol and prejudice remained blurred. But Naomi had turned the lens, adjusted the focus. She had shown that stillness could be a form of resistance. That not shouting didn't mean not fighting. And as she stood again under the streetlight, a quiet figure in a long black coat, the city breathing behind her, she understood what Baldwin once wrote. To be a Negro in this country and to be relatively conscious is to be in a rage almost all the time. But tonight, her rage was quiet, patient, and building. Naomi stood at the edge of the marble corridor, her heels still on the polished floor of Capitol Hill. She was not alone. Behind her trailed echoes, whispers of names unspoken, of women turned away, of lives redacted from the records of this country. But today, she walked forward. The invitation had come quietly, almost reluctantly. Testify before a bipartisan committee on discrimination in private travel sectors. A performative gesture? Perhaps. But Naomi knew the difference between a seat offered and a seat claimed. Inside the chamber, the air was heavy with old wood and older men. Some regarded her with tepid civility, others with passive disdain. And a few, just a few, watched her with the guarded interest of those who sensed the wind was shifting, even if they couldn't name the storm. She adjusted the mic, cleared her throat, and began, not with numbers or legal citations, but with something more American than both, memory. My grandmother used to tell me, she said, her voice measured and low, that in this country, justice is like a train that's always late, but never derails. I believed her. Until I realized some of us were never even allowed on the platform. There was a pause, the kind that swells not from discomfort, but from recognition. Naomi continued. I paid for my seat. I followed the rules. I brought no noise, no threat, no fire. And still, I was marked. Not because of what I did, but because of what I reminded them of. The truth. That dignity doesn't always come dressed like them. That power doesn't always speak in their accent. That presence, quiet, black, and unbending, is still considered a disruption in spaces designed to feel exclusive. A senator leaned forward. Miss Sinclair, some argue that these incidents are rare. Anomalies. Do you believe this was about race? Naomi looked at him, not with anger, but with centuries. I believe, she said, that race in America is the water, not the shark. It is what we're swimming in. So when someone tells me they didn't mean to discriminate, I ask, who taught you to breathe underwater while we drown? Another silence. Longer this time. After the hearing, Naomi stepped into a press corridor. Flashes. Questions. None of it mattered. She wasn't speaking for headlines. She was speaking because silence, in her world, had always cost more than truth. Outside, an older man approached her slowly. Cane in hand. Brown coat. Civil rights pin on his lapel. I watched you in there, he said. And I remembered something. The day we desegregated the buses in Montgomery, they still told us to sit in the back. Not with words. With eyes. With breath. With the air. Naomi nodded. That's the part they never televised. He smiled gently. But you just did. Later that week, Skylux announced a new board initiative, an independent oversight committee, chaired by none other than Naomi Sinclair. A move meant to soothe public nerves, yes, but also to quiet a rebellion that had grown far too elegant to dismiss. She accepted. Not for the optics, but for the long game. On her first day in the boardroom, she wore white. Not because it was armor, but because it was memory. The color her mother wore to church when they marched. The color jurors ignored in photographs of fallen black children. The color of flight crew uniforms, the ones that told her she didn't belong. The meeting opened with pleasantries, projections, and forecasts. Then came the moment, Agenda Item 8. Policy restructuring around passenger escalation protocol. All eyes turned to her. Naomi didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. We will redefine escalation, she said. Because what they did to me was not procedure, it was fear in a uniform. Fear that a black woman in first class might mean the world was changing. I'm here to confirm that fear. By the end of the meeting, 2 policies had been suspended. 3 officers were reassigned. A new training directive was signed. She didn't gloat. She signed her name and left the room like she entered, upright, unshaken. Outside the building, the same press now scrambled for angles. They asked, "What does this mean for the future of corporate accountability?" Naomi gave them only this. "It means we're finally boarding." And then she disappeared into the waiting car, not as a symbol, but as a woman. Whole. Worn. Unyielding. Back in her apartment, she sat on the edge of the couch and removed her shoes slowly. Her phone lit up with a message from her brother. Ma would have been proud. She stared at the screen for a long time, then typed back. She already was. Outside, America rolled on, with its contradictions and promises. But now, somewhere in its bloodstream, the rhythm had changed. Just enough to be felt. And Naomi Sinclair, black, poised, relentless, had claimed her place not just in the cabin, but in the cockpit of a country still learning how to fly.